Hello, I'm Lisa, a pediatric physiotherapist for babies and toddlers. I've seen firsthand how small, everyday habits in modern parenting can lead to big issues for our babies. In this podcast, I'm going to show you how to prevent those issues, treat them if necessary, and restore the joy to parenting. Hello, and welcome back to the Best for Baby podcast. I'm Lisa Rogers-Sargent. I am your host, a pediatric physiotherapist, and today we're going to talk about crawling or the lack of crawling and if it's important, if it means anything for your baby's future development, and if you should be trying to get them to do it, when you should stop trying to get them to do it, and what to do if they have never crawled. So I hope it's going to be interesting and helpful to you at any stage on your baby's development, because if you've still got a tiny baby, it might guide you for the future, and I'll tell you where to go to help to get your baby crawling. And if your child is now a little bit older and never crawled, I'm going to give you lots of really lovely activities that will give you all the benefits that your child would have had if they had crawled, which kind of will hint at the fact that I do think it's quite important to crawl. However, it's not the end of the world if your baby doesn't. We can always compensate for it. So I hope it's going to be really interesting for you. Now, before we start, I would like to just apologize to all my YouTube viewers who have to watch me giving the podcast with such poor quality video. But I shoot it on my very, very old MacBook laptop, and the camera's not great. But that's where we are. I'm super passionate about getting this information out there because I do believe I can be really helpful to parents of little babies. And I heard a beautiful quote the other day. I can't remember where and I can't remember who said it, but it was something about it's a great crime or it's a great shame for people with expert information to go to the grave keeping it in their bones. And I thought, oh, that's how I feel. I'm just trying to share my message and tell people this stuff because I really feel like I can be helpful, and I don't want to only be able to be helpful to people who can come and see me. I'd like to reach a wider audience. So for the meantime, unfortunately, it means that you're stuck watching me on a really old laptop with a really poor video quality. So I apologize for that, but hopefully my listeners aren't so put off by that, and I just hope you guys on YouTube will stick with me despite this, and as soon as I can, I'll upgrade and we'll get a better video quality. So that aside, let's talk about crawling. So when I talk about crawling, I'm really referring to the proper crawling where children are on flat hands, straight elbows, knees bent behind them, and they're moving on their hands and knees. We call it reciprocal crawling when they put one hand and then the opposite knee forward, other hand forward, opposite knee forward. And that's the gold standard crawling. Now we know babies do all sorts of weird and wonderful things, and it's very often meaningless. Sometimes I can look at it and go, this baby's crawling and putting their 1 foot forward all the time. And it's because I can pick it back and go, oh, maybe there was a head turning preference. There's a bit of hypermobility. There's a bit of a thing here or that there. It's not the end of the world. We can resolve those things. And other times it can be an indication of something more serious, shall we say, when there's these big asymmetries, these very repetitive, monotonous, predictable patterns that a baby's moving through. However, if your baby is crawling with a funny little asymmetry here or there, but they're crawling pretty well, they've done it in a kind of typical age range, it's unlikely to be anything. However, sometimes it's a good idea to get a physio to have a look because, as I said, they might piece it back to something in the past and they can just rectify it, align a little bit better. My osteopath colleagues are also really good at this. So if you have an osteopath you can get to, if that's the case, sometimes that would be really helpful. But most of the time, it's not a great cause for concern. Also, parents hear that and panic because then they see their baby occasionally putting 1 foot forward or pushing up and crawling on their hands and feet. And these are all lovely parts of normal development when they do it here and there and they play with it and then they crawl reciprocally for a bit and then maybe they do something else a little bit strange. But this is how they feel and practice and learn their bodies and move. And remember, crawling is the first real locomotion that they've got. So it's a whole new world has opened up to them, and it's not going to be perfect. So we take that into account. We don't worry too much about these little quirks here and there unless they are consistent, repetitive, and even then, probably nothing to worry about. Just a few tweaks here or there with a professional eye might be all you need. So with that, we can talk also about belly creeping or commando crawling. Most babies will do that before they push up and then crawl on all fours, but not all. And for me, I think if you have a baby who belly creeps, the likelihood is that they will go on to crawl on all fours. However, there will be babies who skip belly creeping and go to crawl on all fours. There will also be babies who don't belly creep that will then, when they're sitting, learn to shuffle on their bottoms. Some babies don't crawl reciprocally ever. They sort of bunny hop, where they move their hands and they hop with their legs going behind them. Again, this falls into the category of being a predictable, repetitive, consistent movement that they're doing that's not reciprocal crawling. And usually it's an indication they might have some hypermobility, some sensory processing issues, little things that don't have a massive impact on the child, but we see it because they are then unable to go on and crawl reciprocally. And so those are the kind of things that, while it's nothing major to worry about, you're going to help your child so much by getting that professional opinion and a little bit of help and ways to compensate for what they're missing out on. So we know each gross motor movement has got a place and a reason, and it builds for the next thing, and it causes improvement and efficiency in later skills. So we do want these things. And crawling, particularly, if we look at crawling up on all fours, it's the hardest thing, I think, for a baby to learn to do. I think it's even harder than learning to walk. Sometimes, if a baby has crawled and pushed and pulled up to stand and stood and balancing, they've done so many things to prepare them for walking later that walking is just kind of the next step. Whereas crawling is their first real locomotion. So there's a lot of the sensory stimulus of moving around. Suddenly they're having to rely on their visual ability to move and not to bump into things and to go under and over. So there's this huge learning of like depth perception and spatial awareness that is happening simultaneously as the strain on their muscles to actually move and to do this. And it's really quite a big, tricky movement. You can feel if you have to crawl just how many more muscles are involved. So it's a really big thing, which is understandable then why lots of children will skip it but are able to walk. And I do think if children skip crawling, there's a reason for it. And it is usually, as I say, one of those really small, not massively important reasons, but they're things that very often, if you do have a professional helping you, you can really help them in a number of ways, and it will be of huge benefit to them. So here, we're not talking about children who have got really clear neurological diagnoses who are not crawling because they have a very real neurological reason for it and will possibly not go on to walk or have lifelong difficulties. I'm talking about in your neurotypical population who will go on to walk and live a very normal life but don't crawl. That's the kind of not crawling or affected crawling I'm talking about in this episode. So I've already hinted at why it's so helpful. As I said, because it's also a cognitive learning thing, because they are learning concepts of position, like over, because now they're moving, climbing over things, having to go under things. They're seeing heights for the first time, depth of things, distances. They are moving under their own control. So they're learning that whole cause and effect and exploration and learning that they can be in control of their environment for the first time. They also then are learning to move a certain way and move one side of the body at the same time as the other side of the body in opposite directions, and to link those two sides because we have the crossover of the two sides. So this arm usually moves at the same time as the opposite leg. And so we are firing both sides of the brain and we're getting the crossover happening inside the brain without getting too technical. And that's really important. There are other ways that our babies learn this, whenever they're sitting, for example, and reaching across their midline, we're also firing both sides of the brain, or reaching down one hand, scratching the opposite foot. Any kind of crossover like that helps with this. It's what we call bilateral integration. So the integration of the two sides of the brain and therefore the control of the two sides of the body. But crawling is a real training ground, shall I say, for that. And then, of course, if you're looking at gross motor, it's preparing them for the next stage because it moves them to furniture, which they will then hold onto and start to pull themselves up on. So it gets them going for standing. It also obviously gets them the whole reward system because they, for the first time ever, they can go and get what they want or go to their parent. And so they have these dopamine hits or these cascades of all the feel-good hormones that are released at their own control, which is amazing. And then to move like that against gravity is very taxing on your joints and your muscles. So it builds up stability in the joints. It causes weight bearing through the hands and the arms, as well as the hips and the knees. And that's really important. The weight bearing is really important for bone density development. And then all your joint stability that's being built up by moving like this. And it's really, really strengthening for all the little muscles around those major joints, as well as in the core and the back and the neck. So that's why I always say crawling is like doing intensive physiotherapy. And very often, if I see a baby with delayed development, my goal is to get them crawling if they're not already showing signs of bottom shuffling, because if they're already learning to bottom shuffle, it's really, really hard. I have to work quite intensively with them to take them off that trajectory and get them onto a different one. But if they pre that stage, I say to parents, come on. If a child has delayed development, it's usually because they might have slightly low tone, a bit of motor planning issues, maybe some sensory difficulties, maybe they're hypermobile. There's lots of reasons that are small reasons that their development is delayed, but those are the same reasons why they don't go on to crawl. So I know that this is the child who's probably not going to crawl, but I also know if I can get this child to crawl, it will be like they are doing intensive physiotherapy. And then I can step back and go, you don't need me. Have a few months where you just create opportunity for them to crawl as much as possible. Put them through this training. Get all the benefits of crawling as much as possible because it will help them in the long term. There are also the fine motor things. So it develops your little, what we call the intrinsic hand muscles, the small muscles in the hands, which will later go on to help with pencil grip and fine motor control. That said, my daughter crawled, and she crawled very well for a very long time, and she holds a pencil like this sometimes and sometimes like this, and we're working really hard on it. She's got a really delayed pencil grip. So, you take everything as it is. And I also look at her and I think, well, maybe because I know she's very hypermobile, she's very, very tall. So she had all these things stacked against her. So I worked really hard to get her crawling. She crawled quite late because it was so difficult for her, but she crawled, and she crawled well from 10 months. So the old-fashioned range was about 8 to 10 months. Now most of the children I see are crawling between 10 to 12 months. So I was really proud when my daughter managed at 10 months. And then I think, well, I probably, as a physio, worked on all her big gross motor things and never did much about her fine motor. So now we sit with this strange pencil grip. Or maybe, you take it as it is. Maybe all those things mean that she was always going to have a tricky time developing her pencil grip, and it would have been worse without the crawling. We'll never know because we can never take away something. We would never stop a child from crawling just to see what the effects would be. So just take it with a pinch of salt. As healthcare professionals, we believe there are so many benefits from crawling, and yet we go on to see so many children who never crawled, and they don't seem to have any real difficulties. So bear that in mind. Don't panic if you have a child who didn't crawl. Certainly, it's more important for the children who are going to go on and have some delay, or who are hypermobile or have sensory difficulties. We definitely want them to crawl because it would appear that if we get them crawling, we can kind of minimize some of the effects of those difficulties that they have later on. So I've also spoken briefly about sensory. It's a massive sensory benefit to crawl. So first of all, because we desensitize the bare hands as they, just in contact with the surface all the time, and the legs being dragged along the ground. It's a big sensory desensitization. Secondly, their head is moving through space. So we have sensory processing in terms of your vestibular system inside your ear. When we move the head through space, when they do any big movements, and remember, other than rolling, this is the first time they are moving their head through space at their own volition. And so it's a really big sensory stimulation for them. And that goes on to affect their muscle tone and their desire to move and their threshold to moving. So from a sensory side, it's also really helpful. And most of all, it develops the joint awareness, what we call your proprioception. And that is knowing what your joints are doing without having to look at them. You're just aware of your joints. You're aware of your body. And a baby has to develop joint and body awareness before they can actually go on to develop spatial awareness. So they've already started to develop their proprioception by this stage. Then they start to crawl and it improves, and they're simultaneously exploring their environment, so their spatial awareness starts to develop at the same time. And we know children who are hypermobile, low-toned, have a bit of weakness here and there, they will have problems with their sensory things. So you get children who have difficulty in integrating all the sensory information that they have, and that's on its own. And then you have children who have difficulty integrating all their sensory information because they are hypermobile, low-toned, and any one of those minor conditions that I spoke about earlier. So we know crawling is ticking all those boxes that you would go and do with a child as a therapist. You would work on sensory, proprioception, weight bearing, strengthening, moving, all of those things. And crawling just does it. And we're all busy. So if you get your child crawling, you get them to crawl a lot, you go, phew, we've done therapy for those things. So what I'm trying to say is it's more important for some babies than others. And children who do go on to just walk anyway, the jury's kind of out as to what the long-term consequences are. Therapists, we believe there are all sorts of difficulties later on, but the actual clear evidence is quite minimal in that. So be reassured by that, but just know that it's always helpful if you can incorporate a few of the activities that I'll discuss at the end of this, that are building up muscle areas, joint awareness, desensitizing, promoting good sensory processing. So they're always helpful activities anyway. So let's look at a few of those, because the key thing here is that crawling is a very short window. As I said, usually between 8 and 12 months, shall we say, most babies will crawl. So once you've passed that, particularly if they're bottom shuffling, it's very hard to go back. If they have spent quite a lot of time on their tummy or creeping, belly creeping, or even doing the little bunny hop, then they are getting partial benefits of crawling. But if they've never done that and they're now a child who's walking, you're not going to go back and make them crawl. That would make no sense. So now we have to find fun little activities that give them the benefits of crawling that are now age appropriate and stage appropriate for the child. So we're going to look firstly at the desensitization. And the best thing there is to give them loads of toys to play with, things that they can crumple and scrunch. There's lots of those those silver blankets that they give you at the end of a race. Those are lovely for crunching. They do make a bit of a noise, but that's another sensory component. Crunching and playing with that, letting them play in buckets of uncooked pasta, playing with noodles, playing with beads, allowing them to be barefoot as much as possible, particularly outdoors. If you have access to your own garden that you trust and there's no broken glass, be barefoot in the home, rubbing their feet on carpets, playing in the beach sand, making them, twist their feet when you're on the beach on a holiday, making them rub their feet like that. Walking as much barefoot as possible will help with all that desensitization later on. If your baby's still younger and you can, when every time you change their nappy, just pat their feet on the ground, rub their feet backwards and forwards, rub their feet together, blow raspberries on their feet. A bit of, when they get older, doing baby massage is really difficult because they're not lying still very much. So when they lie on their backs, you could just do lots of hands down the legs and then just with your thumbs on the foot sole as much as possible. After a bath, take quite a rough towel, dry their legs, dry their foot soles, spend time rubbing the foot sole with that rough towel. Do the same for the hands and the arms. So you're just giving lots of desensitizing stimulation so that they're not like, oh, I'm so sensitive. Because often we find the babies who haven't crawled, when they lay on their backs, they also have lain with their legs sort of flopped outwards and their feet up, instead of being able to have their feet on the ground and rub and kick and desensitize their own feet. So they also would have missed out on certain gross motor activities when they were lying on their backs, and that's because they have another issue, which is hypermobility or slight low tone. So the little legs have flopped out. That made crawling difficult, but also made the desensitization of their feet difficult when they're little. So sometimes we find their walking is also delayed because they're just so sensitive. So we really stimulate their feet. Vibration is a lovely sensory sensation that if we introduce it, it's quite calming. It's not something that overstimulates and overexcites you. So they can spend time holding a vibration toy. There's lots of different ones. I will put 2 links in the show notes because there's one that's for older children. Basically, they're toys that you push and they continue to vibrate. And I recently found a lovely one for younger babies that is great. I mean, even if you're not worrying about crawling yet, but for your really young baby, it's like a vibrating teething ring. And for them to hold that, it just gives that lovely sensory input, which will help also to build up their joint awareness and the desensitization. So we want to think about just giving them opportunity to feel things through their foot soles, through the skin on their legs, and through the hands, if they have missed out on crawling, or even do that in preparation of crawling with your younger babies. The other thing that we look at is the fact that when they crawl, they build up shoulder girdle stability. And if you don't crawl, there are far fewer opportunities later in life to build up that stability in the shoulders. Once you're walking, you're building up stability in your hips because you're on your feet, and you're strengthening your legs all day long because you walk, whereas you never walk on your hands again after you've crawled. So it's nice to focus on the shoulder girdle and the shoulder muscles to build up that stability if your child has not crawled. And one of the best ways is climbing. So having them or giving them access to climbing frames out in the park, ideally, climbing trees, what we all used to do and very few children do anymore. And of course, climbing at soft play areas. That's possibly more what our children are doing nowadays and have more access to. So find anything where they can climb with their arms or hang suspended. So monkey bars, a lot of schools have monkey bars, and they have these outdoor play and learn sessions where the kids naturally are doing it during the day, and that's fabulous, and that's now research based. We want them to be doing things like that. But from quite a young age, you can take them out to climbing frames in the park and get them hanging from that, because that is really a really good exercise, even not to do with making up for crawling, but for general development, hanging from monkey bars, and later on, going from one to the other. And your older walking, running, jumping child will still enjoy that, and that will still be building up that lovely shoulder girdle stability. We also look at having them do activities for quite a long time where the hand is higher than shoulder level. So here you could do things if you've got like big glass doors or windows where you spray shaving foam on there and get them to wipe it, wash it off, wash the windows, and with the other hand for a while. So it's those like small movements where the hand is kept above shoulder level for quite a while. You can also buy now marker pens where you can write on windows and then that they wipe clean. And that's quite fun because you can then draw like a few boxes just above their shoulder height and tell them to color in the box, and then draw another box. They've got to color in 5 boxes in a row, or whatever. You can do an activity like that. And you can of course put a big piece of paper up against a wall and get them to paint above hand. Finger paint is great because then they're more likely to do it with both hands. And then something for the younger children is to suspend like a washing line above their height. So you can take a tie and tie it between 2 chairs, and then you've got a rope, and just get them to sit underneath it, and a few pegs hanging up. Like you can make fake socks, cut them out of paper or take socks and get them to hang up the washing like that. There are lots of things you can do. You can get them to hold a towel and you hold the towel and you pull against each other like a tug of war. Anything like that, if you are making sure, particularly, the hand is higher than the shoulder, you're really going to be working on the stability of the shoulder. But the shoulder muscles, any kind of resisted pulling or pushing activities, getting them to push a heavy chair, putting heavy things inside a push chair and getting them to push that. Go for a walk where they have to push this heavy push chair. Even taking a children's walking toy trolley and make them push it outside on the grass. That's quite a heavy friction and resistance. So they've got to push really hard there. Now, most of these activities, particularly the resisted pushing and pulling, are also going to be strengthening for the core and the oblique muscles. Now, that's one of the biggest things that crawling does. It strengthens the core muscles and your oblique, your crossover abdominal muscles. So we want to do that. So any of this heavy pushing and pulling, particularly in standing or walking, is really helpful. So I also like to get a towel or a scarf or something and get your child to stand on a spot, and you hold the other side and tell them, I'm a fish, reel me in, and you get them to pull the scarf and you hold one end, but they must succeed. They mustn't pull too hard. It's not so much about the arm muscles pulling, it's about them standing upright and pulling something towards them. So you're just giving a bit of resistance and they go hand over hand and pull the scarf, the towel, the piece of rope, whatever it is you've got, towards them, and then they reel you in and they win. If you're not such a good motivation for them, you can tie something to the end, ideally something quite heavy, and they pull it towards them. And then you can also stand behind them and help them to go hand over hand. For a smaller child, you might start with them sitting doing this, then build up to them standing. And as they get older and you're going to really challenge their core and balance, you get them to stand on a cushion, which is wobbly, and to do it as well. The same for strengthening the core is getting them to walk over any kind of a wobbly surface. And that's great at your soft play activities, trampolines. If you don't mind setting up an obstacle course with your cushions on the floor and they walk over those, or they walk across your sofas, or they walk across your bed, anything like that that's got give and wobbly is going to activate the core and help to compensate for that time where they could have strengthened the core in crawling. And then finally, a really lovely activity that will activate those oblique, those crossover diagonal abdominal muscles, and also help to work for that bilateral integration that we spoke about, where you involve both sides of the brain, is to get them to take something with their right hand from their left foot and their left hand from their right foot. Now, the best way to do this, if they're a little child, is to get them sitting at the edge of a sofa with their little legs bent over the edge, and you put like a stacking ring around one foot, and you get them to take the ring off the right foot with the left hand, and you hold up the ring holder in front of them, and then they put the little ring on that, and then you put a ring on the other foot, and so you go, you do repetitions. Now, the key here is that they're bringing the foot up to the hand, and it's the opposite to opposite. That way we're involving the oblique muscles because they're lifting the leg up. If they don't want to, if you can't quite get them to do opposite hand to opposite foot, just hold one hand gently and show them, because these are now older children, remember, to do it that way. As they get older, you can then start doing things like taking washing pegs and putting 5 washing pegs on each trouser leg and getting them to take those off, because that's a lovely fine motor activity, which we're going to be looking at in a moment. And squeezing the peg is the fine motor activity, but it's also the crossover activity. So they take one peg off the left trouser leg with their right hand, and you can hold up a pencil in front of them and get them to put it on the pencil. Then the opposite side and put it there. And as we go, they've learned this because you've done it from easy when they were younger, and you've upped the ante almost. You made it trickier and trickier the older they get, to a point where your 3, 4, 5-year-old is standing up and doing it. Now, the 3-year-old may need to hold onto a chair with the left hand, lift the left foot and take it off with the right hand, then hold onto a chair with the right hand and do it. And over time, we're going to be improving their single leg balance, as well as working on those muscles and fine motor control when they're lifting up the leg, balancing and standing. And then you can really challenge them by making them stand on a wobbly surface whilst doing that as well. So those are some really lovely core activities and oblique abdominal muscle activities to use to compensate for not having crawled. And then, as I said, crawling is a really good activity for developing fine motor control later because it strengthens those little hand muscles. So here there's loads of things. You can just look online and say fine motor activities. But the big things is that you want a variety of positions. So you sometimes want the child to reach with their fingers extended and pick up things between the thumb and all the fingers extended. Sometimes with the fingers nicely bent, pulling and squeezing and scrunching all different size objects because the different size is going to activate the muscles in different ways. So Lego is really nice. And with your younger child, you have Duplo. So pulling bricks apart. You can put a whole set of, 2 bricks put together and say, I'm going to time you to pull those apart and throw them into the bag of Duplo or the box of Duplo. And as they get older, you move to Lego pieces, which are more tricky to pull apart. You can use Play-Doh. You can buy on Amazon as well rolls of Velcro, and you can stick different toys together with Velcro and make them pull them apart. Obviously, the more Velcro you put on, the harder it is to pull apart. And you can use 2 big blocks stuck together, 2 small things together, which will change the grip of pulling apart. Any kind of Play-Doh activities where they're squeezing, rolling. You can bury things inside Play-Doh that they have to pull apart and pull the things out of. Making shapes with Play-Doh. There's just so many lovely things you can think of. Any kind of scrunch toys. You can take pieces of paper and get them to scrumple them up into balls. All of those things are really good for developing that fine motor control, and also at the same time they're going to be a bit sensory as well for the hands. So really worth doing. If your child obviously loves to paint, to color in, to draw, to cut, to write, go with those. Those are all really good fine motor control activities. However, they will be only for the dominant hand. So you sometimes want to give them things that aren't quite so high level that they can do with both hands. And then lastly, you can always, when your child is still a bit younger, you can say to them, let's play a crawling game. And we are an animal and we crawl around for short periods. Just know the older the child is, the more likely they're not going to like it. It's going to become uncomfortable on their knees. Little babies have got so much more padding. They haven't learned any different yet. So they're quite happy being on hands and knees. Older children, less so. But if you turn it into a game, it could be fun. You can make it short distance, but getting them to crawl across the sofa so it's more comfortable for them, but also harder because there's more resistance in crawling over something soft. Getting them to crawl across a bed, putting a few cushions on the ground, a few mattresses on the ground if you've got cot mattresses to crawl across, and then putting like a few cushions underneath a duvet and getting them to crawl over that on a bed can be a bit of a game that gets a bit of crawling, but it's high impact crawling because it's more difficult to do. So that's fun. You could also get them to crawl up your stairs whenever they can. So it might just be your way to sneak in a bit of crawling if they are still young enough not to be galloping up the stairs on their feet. But the idea is, if your child never crawled, just give them opportunity where they can as a game if they're not too old for it not to be sensible anymore. You also get pop-up tunnels that you can buy, crawl under a table, crawl through a tunnel of chairs. Even though they are a child who's now walking, if it's part of the game, it might be quite a good thing for them. So any physio will always say to you, it's always going to be good for a child to be doing anything active, and to be moving and to be enjoying movement. And that is the key here, is that all of these activities should be fun. They should be play-based. The child should feel in control of them. You should stop before the child gets frustrated with them and help them to succeed initially when it's too tricky for them. And then as they succeed each time, they enjoy it. And then they're going to be more motivated to do it. So keep it light, keep it fun, keep it happy. And even if your child did crawl, they're lovely activities to do. That's going to have a positive impact on your child's development in general. So I hope that was helpful. And that brings me to the end. And as always, I wish you all the very best and all the best for your baby.